So in summary of population versus sample, what we've got is, for example, the current population in the United States is roughly 299 million, or right at 300 million people. If I want to know how they feel about something, I don't have to ask each person the questions. What I can do is I can just take a sample of the population. You'll notice I use the term random sample of the population here. And then what I do, I take some mathematically scientific equations and some processes, and then I apply those findings to the whole population. Then I can just assume with some pretty good certainty that the question that I ask the sample, their beliefs are going to be very close to those beliefs of the American population. And what we need to notice here on this slide is a very specific term that I use here. Okay? The term that I use is random sample. In order for our poll to be what we call valid, to measure what it's supposed to measure, I told you we had to have some mathematical and scientific principles that needed to be followed. And one of the biggest mathematical scientific processes that need to be followed is we have to make our sample random. Which means if I want to find out how the American people feel about a question, I have to make sure that the people that I'm asking that question are randomly selected. And this is a very important concept, because a lot of people, when they think about a poll and having a random sample, they misunderstand what random actually means. Some people believe that in order for a sample to be random, that sample has to be representative of the population, which means if you have 10% of your population are white, 10% are African American, 25% are Asian, and the rest are Hispanic. If you make sure that your sample has 10% white, 10% Caucasian, 15% Asian, and then the rest are Hispanic, your sample isn't random, because you controlled. You said, okay, I want 10% to be this, and 10% to be that, and 15% to be that. Okay? That's not random. A random sample is when everybody in the population has the exact same chance of being picked. So if I want to measure how people in the United States feel about an issue, everybody in the United States has to have the equal chance of being picked. Okay? That's what makes a sample truly random. Okay? Another thing that you need to really truly understand about your sample is that your sample has to come from your population. And that's pretty easy when we're trying to measure how everybody in the United States feels about a topic. But let's kind of step back into something we talked about earlier. What if our population is the state of Missouri, and we want to figure out how do people in the state of Missouri feel about abortion, for example? When I create my sample, everybody in the state of Missouri has to have an equal chance of being picked to make it random. But I also have to make sure that everybody in my sample comes from the population, comes from Missouri. Because if I ask the question and 10% of the people that are part of my sample live in Illinois or Arkansas, then that sample isn't valid. The test or the poll isn't going to be measuring what it's supposed to measure. So when we look at the sample that's used in a poll, we need to make sure that, one, the sample is random. Everybody has an equal chance of being picked. The second thing is that that sample has to come from your population. And if either of those two things aren't in place, then your poll is not going to measure what it's designed to measure, and then your poll is not going to be considered valid. Okay? And then one last thing that we need to know about sample. Sample is very important, because the larger your sample, the more reliable or the more accurate your poll is going to be. So if we've got, for example, 300 million people that live in the United States, if I only ask 10 people that question, there's a big difference between the sample size and the population size. And the chances of the answer that your sample gave you matching up with your population isn't very good. So the larger your sample is, the closer you're going to get to having the poll have a really, really legitimate chance of saying, hey, the sample believed this, and we can also say that it's pretty good chance that the rest of the population is going to feel this. The larger your sample is, the more accurate your poll is going to be in measuring the population's point of view. Okay? But I don't want you to believe that sample size has to be this huge astronomical number. As a matter of fact, as long as a sample is truly random, if you're trying to measure what the people in the United States feel about an issue, your sample can be as small as 10,000 people, 15,000 people. 10 or 15,000 people is much less than 1% of the U.S. population. But if the scientific principles and mathematical principles are applied, your sample truly comes from your population, and that sample is truly random. 10 or 15,000 people in a sample could make it a very valid and reliable poll.